Spirit. Amen. All right, everyone, welcome back to Nets in the Water. I'm your host, John Barreto. Nets in the Water is trying to stoke the flame of Catholic education, and today we have an absolute expert in the house, Dan Boyd, 10 plus years working in the church, just immersed in the life of it, doctorate in education, authored a book called Go! Make Disciples, or just Go! Make Disciples, either one. And yeah, 10 years working for the Diocese of Orlando, fully immersed in the interest of evangelizing towards the laity and the youth and everything in that realm. So Dan, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm excited.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of fun stories from your time with the diocese and all of that stuff. But before we even get into all of that, tell me a little bit about you. What was your, I don't even know, like, do you have any siblings? Were you always raised in the faith? Did you have a big conversion in your life? Maybe you used to have face tattoos. You were in prison.
Yes, no.
The mustache hides
in that
the
order.
face
Yeah,
tattoo.
yeah, absolutely.
Perfect.
No, just one up there. So born into a great Catholic family. Both my parents are converts. Not probably in the style that a lot of us are accustomed to, like somebody coming from a Protestant background who's on fire. It was more kind of like an attraction to the church, at least for my mom. And then
Okay.
my mom told my dad, I'm only going to marry a Catholic. And he was like, okay, well, that's easy enough. So he became Catholic and was a very faithful Catholic for a long time. And then when I was in middle school, he had a deepening of his faith where I think he went from being an obedient Catholic to one who actively wanted to love God. And that had a really big impact on me and on my siblings. And so I feel like I had an amazing childhood, and I'm very grateful to my parents for the way they raised us, especially in helping us become disciples of Jesus. And they gave me every opportunity to learn of the goodness of God and decide to follow him on my own. And I can't ask for anything else from my parents than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful. So did you, when you were getting raised like this, did you have like a big conversion moment? Were you always kind of with your faith?
Yeah, both. So I would say I have the good fortune to have never wanted to do anything other than be Catholic. And I like to argue. I like to have fun conversations, deep conversations. And I think there was a little part of me that just is naturally combative and it's like, hey, cool, I can defend the faith. I can talk about the faith. And so apologetics was probably one of the first things that attracted me. And then along the way, I went on a Eucharistic-centered retreat, and that was similar to the way I described my dad's deepening. Is for me, that changed the way I viewed faith from thinking of allegiance to the church, almost like allegiance to a nation and patriotism, to I'm in love with God and I want to give him my life in gratitude for what he's done for me.
Wow. When did that happen?
16.
Wow. Okay.
I went to be my buddy's wingman. He was going on this retreat for a girl, and so I just thought it would be cool to go along with him. And I'm so glad I did.
Amazing. So were you at that time? Were you in public school? Were you in Catholic school? What was your experience with that like?
I did a little bit of everything.
Okay.
So mostly from middle school onward, I was homeschooled, and so I spent 1 year in public high school because I wanted to play football, and then finished out the rest of the way homeschool. So I think at that point, I had gone back to homeschooling, but I'd known private school and public school and homeschool. So.
Okay. Well, I'm curious how your upbringing led to such a passion for Catholic education. It sounds like you kind of had some experience in it, not really, but now you're super immersed in it, and you spent years of your life dedicated to it.
I think it's probably by like temperament, personality, by just the things that naturally interest me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm into education. And because of my love for God, it led me to Catholic education.
Mm-hmm.
But my first career outside of or after college was actually teaching Spanish. And so it was like there's a love for teaching. I think I have the heart of a teacher, and it's just one of the gifts that God gave me.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody has that. And I can't say that I would know what it's like to not want to teach because I can't help myself. I'm doing it always.
Yeah.
And other people have gifts in other areas. And so I think, Scripture speaks to the beauty and the kind of multiplicity of gifts spread across the church. And this is the one I got, and I love it.
Yeah. And it's a good segue too, that like you have this deep love of the faith and of Christ, and you have a deep love of teaching. And I think obviously intellectually those things are very married, but I think in practice it's kind of easy for the line to get blurred between like being a super solid teacher and being a super solid evangelist.
Yeah, there's within the profession, right? You want to be excellent. You want to be good. You want to help your students learn. but is that the outcome we want, right? Like, do we want learned students who are tepid in their faith? No, we don't. Now, the flip side, like, it would be great if we had students who are passionate about their faith who also knew a lot about God, because then I think that helps them witness to his goodness even more. And so I don't think that's too much of a dichotomy. I think it's easy. It would be easy to fall like one side or the other, but we just hold the two in tension and say, okay, the ultimate outcome I want here, no matter what, is for this student to love God and respond to his invitation to follow him. And so that's what needs to be before the student in some way explicitly when I'm teaching. And the rest of it is good because I'm, as a lover of education and learning about all things, I've never learned about something that I don't think is worth learning, because everything can lead us back to God. And so any knowledge can help us love God more and help us build the kingdom. And so, yeah, like everything's worth learning. Everything's worth learning well. So let's be really good teachers. Let's be really good educators in whatever subject, because knowledge of that subject can help us love God more. And the ultimate goal is for somebody to say yes to the invitation to follow Jesus.
How does that couple in terms of like just practicality speaking? Kind of we're going to get to like a lot of these common distractions, but it's like, it still seems to me that it's like, all right, if I'm a teacher who's really interested in making my students like learned and they love learning and they know their topic well, but also really want to infuse like the faith, like I just practically speaking, that seems like a very difficult thing to do.
So let's think about like, what does that mean? And oftentimes we hear things like, we want people to love the faith. We want people to love their faith. Like, well, the faith, I think we're using that term as a proxy, and we might not, like a fill-in, a substitute. Do we know what we mean by that? Because what the goal of human life is to love God. And so I think that's really what we mean when we say the faith, right? So what we believe in is, we believe in God. We believe the promises he has offered us for eternal life by choosing to follow Jesus as members of the Catholic Church. We believe the teachings of the church as the best way for a moral life to love and serve God. So we believe in God. We believe the things held forth by the Catholic Church. So just subtle difference there. That kind of like, that encompasses the word faith encompasses all of that. What's the most important of the two? Love of God and choosing to follow him. And the rest is the life's work of conforming our life to the life of Christ. So how do you get there? It's an invitation. I think it's worth pondering, are we comfortable inviting people to follow Jesus? You mentioned the line earlier kind of like caught my attention, nets in the water, right? So when I was writing my book with my co-author Justin, we talked about this idea of like, maybe we should, the title of the book should have something to do with like casting your net or cast a wide net, with the idea of, hey, let's be intentional about evangelizing. To be intentional, like you actually ask somebody, do you want to follow Jesus? And very accidentally, we don't make that invitation. We kind of do it in a corporate way or an aggregate way, right? But the faith is also individual. And so we, like, what do we see Jesus do? What do we see his disciples do? He asks people specifically, like, follow me, come follow me. And the response of the disciple is to follow Jesus. So we can accidentally be generic in the way we encourage people to follow Jesus. But then it's almost like, hey, we encourage you to be patriotic, and like love of country is a good thing, but like love of God is more important and deeper.
Yeah.
And so
like deeply necessary.
Yes.
Because I feel like sometimes it can, especially in an academic setting, it can start to feel like you're here necessarily to get educated, to get a good test score, to get a good grade.
Yeah.
And secondarily, it'd be nice if you became more Catholic.
Yes. Yeah. And let's flip that on its head. And so like, we want people to graduate with the kind of a conviction, yes, I want to follow Jesus. I'll figure out how as I go. So it almost sounds simplistic, but invite people to make a choice. And there's, this moment, and granted, like you can make this choice over and over and over, but at some point we want to invite people, do you choose to leave your old way of life behind and follow Jesus. And I want to make that explicit because I think it can be, like, for instance, we do this in Mass at the beginning of every Mass, right? That's what the penitential rite is. Do you choose to repent of sin and follow Jesus? Yeah, absolutely. But do we stop in our daily life and think about, have I consciously chosen to do that in such a way that I can point to, okay, these are the things I'm no longer going to do? Because I think it can be very automatic for people at Mass because there's 1,000 other people saying the same thing.
It.
Yeah.
But how do you instill that as a teacher? Like, especially when it gets to a deeper level.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for teachers to begin to learn to recognize the signs of conversion. And so rather than just thinking of, okay, success is this child getting an A, whether or not that has anything to do with their love of God, if they begin to start thinking of every one of their students as somebody on a journey and recognizing where they are on that journey, because that tells you, much like a doctor can recognize the like signs and symptoms of an illness, and that tells them how to apply medicine. If we understand where somebody is in the journey, we understand how we can walk with them, how we can accompany them, so that they can make the next step and carry on. And at a certain point, like I've had students who, they were at the very beginning, they were closed to a conversation with God because they didn't trust the church, they didn't trust God, they didn't trust his followers. Understandable. And then I had other students who were so passionate. They loved the church. They loved going to Mass. They loved youth group, that kind of stuff. They had already been offered that choice. And so they need something different. So you've got to differentiate your approach, which takes time. But if that's the priority, right? The priority is helping people be further along that path of discipleship by the time they leave. Okay, well then let's prioritize the thing that's important. When you recognize that people are at the point that they can respond to the invitation to follow Jesus, then you extend that. And it could be, I remember there were times when I saw, I would say, the beginnings of curiosity about faith in God in students. And so I would invite them to a Bible study. We would get a group of students together and be like, hey, I can tell that you're taking this seriously. Do you want to do something additional? It's entirely voluntary, right? And it would be like, okay, during lunch, we're going to go to the library and the 6 of us will just sit around and do something. And throughout that time, that's an opportunity to say, here's the message of Jesus. Do you, and these were not Catholic students. They happened to be at a Catholic school, but they weren't Catholic students. So do you, how does this sound to you? Do you want to make this your commitment? And often they would say, yeah, I do. And it's shocking, I think there's a temptation to be afraid. Well, what if this is too pushy? What if I'm getting in their face? What if they say yes? Like we I think can too easily go in the negative direction. Maybe they're just waiting for that. There's a story I heard one time about a guy who was intentional about inviting his neighbors over. His son heard the gospel at Mass one Sunday, love your neighbors. And the son was like, does Jesus mean like our actual neighbors? It's like, yeah, he does. And so they started just having Sunday potlucks. And there was a guy who looked a little rough. He was like, like the tattoos and whatnot, that some of us might be hesitant about talking to somebody like that. And so this guy had been coming around for several weeks, and he said to the host, he was like, hey, I saw you on the internet. You talk about Jesus and that kind of stuff. And so the host got a little nervous. He was like, yeah, that's me. And then the guy said, when are you going to talk to me about Jesus? It's like, you don't know when somebody is waiting for the invitation, and they might be the one who's too nervous to bring it up.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Is to go back to this nets in the water idea. Is like part of the thinking behind the name nets in the water is that like we are the nets in the water. Like it's not as so much like we should cast our nets into it, but we are those nets. But part of that story that I really like is that us, the viewer, we don't actually get to see what goes on between the nets and the fish. Like all we know is that the fish somehow ended up in the nets, but the nets had to be present to it. And I almost think this invitation is like this idea of like, there's a fish in front of me. All I know is that the Lord put me in this water, and my job is to make it clear that I'm a net. And if this fish needs to come here, it does. Like that's it. And that's just the role of the educator, is to make it like we don't get to know what happens once you make this invitation. But I will say, to maybe challenge it a little bit more, because I agree with you, obviously, that Catholic education, like the foremost goal is the evangelization and the formation of our young people. But to take it to kind of its like logical conclusion, let's say there's a school, academics are meh, but let's say every single student who goes there, it becomes Catholic. Like all of a sudden, doesn't that just kind of become like a breeding ground for like Catholic students to go to the good Catholic school? And if I'm a non-Catholic family, unless I want my kid to become Catholic, which if I'm a non-Catholic family, why would I send my kid there if I know that academics are kind of secondary and their main goal is to make my kid Catholic? It would kind of de-incentivize non-Catholics from coming into this environment. Like, wouldn't it draw them in more if first it was a really strong academic institution, and then, by the way, we also care about your kids a lot and we evangelize to them. But first and foremost, they're going to have great test scores and great grades and all that stuff.
When you find that school, let me know, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I think if somebody were to bring that up, is like, oh, well, what if this happened? Like, it hasn't happened yet. Like, we have not found a school that's like terrible academically and successful at helping students choose to follow Jesus in the Catholic Church. That just doesn't exist, as far as I know, right? No, like, because I think there'd be a bunch of articles and stories about it, because everybody would want to copy what they do. Now, it's not hard to have an academically excellent school. And so it's a number of things, right? It's not accidental. You have to be deliberate about it, but those things will come. It would be great if all of our teachers were also evangelists. Right now, I don't think we're in an environment where we have that luxury of saying, like, I'm going to choose a physics teacher who is a great evangelist. So that's okay, right? Hopefully we can find somebody who is still passionate about the faith and loves God and is willing to witness to their students about the love of God. But if we can't, that's okay, because the culture of the school, and you could say the approach of evangelization, can be built into the culture and the way of life. And so you don't need every single teacher to be pushing in the same degree, right? They can't work against it. And maybe they're only lending a hand here and there where they can. It'd be helpful if they remembered the ultimate goal of education is still to love God and love neighbor. So I had some really great coworkers who I think were outstanding in their profession, math, science, humanities, you name it. And they didn't, especially like the hard sciences, there's not a lot of opportunity to make that an evangelical class, which is fine. Just don't work against the church. And so we're not going to have the problem. Like, we can still seek out the best teachers in those areas and evangelize students well.
To continue to go down this rabbit hole kind of these common distractions, something else we talked about before this podcast was this idea of like vanity metrics. Yeah. Like schools kind of putting forth numbers to make themselves look good. Yeah. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing that.
I probably wouldn't want to say that I think people are doing it to make themselves look good so much as it might be hard to figure out what to measure. We're good at measuring academic success, right? It's like, okay, well, we want to know how well did students do? An even better metric is how much did students improve? So if they came in at X and they left at X plus 20, that's growth. That's what we want to see. Like, you don't just want to see students doing well, you want to see them growing. And how can you measure that from a faith perspective? Well, what are the things we want to see? There's no measure of holiness, right? You can't take a gram of it. There's no ruler for it. But what does it look like? It looks like changes in habits and changes in lifestyle and changes in intention. And so it could be at the beginning of the year, or even as students come in as a freshman and leave as a senior, you take a simple survey of, how often are you participating in these activities? How often do you on your own seek the sacraments? Do you ask to go to Mass? Do you ask to go to confession? Do you go on your own, right? Is it weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, never? We want to see a change in that. How often do you pray? How often do you read Scripture? And again, you could do these things without being holy, right? Because you could do them for Pharisaical reasons.
Yeah.
But if you see a growth in these things over time, you'd have to ask, okay, well, why is this? And while they're not sufficient in themselves, you could say we would still want to see those things be present as evidence of conversion. And so look for the signs of what conversion would be. Like, if you kind of dream of the end state, right? What would holy high school students do? What would like really good high school disciples do? They're still going to have fun and do the things that high school students would do in a healthy way. And they should pray more. They should be learning about the faith. They should want to read scripture. They should want to spend time with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. They should go to mass and go to confession regularly.
Yeah.
And they hopefully they can articulate how they want God to be a part of their life for the rest of their lives. So those would be, I think, very healthy metrics. Something that could be like a vanity metric would be how many students participated in this retreat. Well, if it's a mandatory retreat, right? It's like, I don't know that you get credit for that.
Yeah.
Because you could go on that retreat and not have any positive change. So if you switched over to a business sector and said like, okay, you want to have a conference where your potential customers could come and learn about things related to your product. It's not sufficient to say how many people came. Ultimately, you want to know like, what was the increase in sales as a result of this event? And if it was 0, is it fair to say you wasted your time?
Yeah.
Probably. And so like I don't know the most current research on this, but the numbers in terms of attrition of how many students go through Catholic school and choose to never come back to church is somewhere between like 30% and 50%. So we're losing somewhere between 50% 30% and 50% of all Catholic students who come through Catholic schools.
Those are Catholic students, not just
yes,
non-Catholic
correct.
students.
Those are Catholic students. Wow. So are we okay with that? Is that the best we can do? You know, and it's not to say that it's the school's fault. That's not a causal thing, because it's way more dependent upon family life. But what can schools do to like turn the tide a little bit, and how much can we assist in the effort to change that statistic? That's a much more important thing to look at than how many kids went on retreat this year, or how many cans did we gather. Like, I want to gather cans. I want to raise funds for charities. But it's almost, it's like we're explicitly warned not to advertise the good that we do.
Yeah.
And yet it's such an easy thing to advertise the good that we do, because it makes us look good as an institution. And I know we're not doing it individually, so it's a little bit different than doing it corporately or, as an organization. But those things don't translate to disciples. And I think the truth of that has played out for, I don't know, at least the last several decades, as we've seen a decline in church membership.
Yeah. So then what would you say to a Catholic school teacher who's like, all right, cool, I agree with you, Dan. Great call. I should prioritize evangelization over academics, but still care about both.
Yeah.
Like, what would you tell them practically? Because it feels like one of those, and I think I touch on this on so many conversations, because so many of these topics feel like they're so easy to be like, all right, cool, I hope my principal does that. Like, okay, cool, I hope my department head starts to emphasize that. Like, what are the actual practicals to do this?
Yeah, so the church spells this out really nicely for us. It's called the catechumenal model, which means that people go through a kind of a series of life transitions where they start with no affiliation or trust towards the church. They gradually develop that, right? So there's a step of, okay, we want to cultivate the sense of like, let us earn the opportunity to witness to you and tell us who you are, or tell us who we are. And then once people move into that phase, right? That was called pre-evangelization or evangelization, right? Evangelization means we announce the good news. So prioritize in your class in some way. First, like developing a sense of trust, right? This doesn't need to be day one of freshman year, but developing a sense of trust with students so that they're curious about Jesus and his church and his followers. And then evangelize, like share the good news. What is the good news? The good news is that God created us to know and love him, be in a relationship with him. We turned away from him as humanity, but Jesus died on the cross to save us from our sins and restore us to that relationship. And not just us, but me and you. And so Steve, John, Susan, Blake, would you like to accept Jesus' offer to be forgiven for your sins and follow him? And be explicit about that. And that's a hard thing to do. I don't want to, it's simple, but it's hard. And so at some point we want to invite students to follow Jesus. And like Jesus said to the disciples, come, follow me, I will make you fishers of men. And they dropped their nets and they followed him. So we'll stick with the metaphor. We want nets in the water,
Yeah.
right? We want people evangelizing.
Yeah.
But that's symbolic of there's a lifestyle change.
Mm-hmm.
Once, and this is the approach the church takes, once people have made the decision to follow Jesus, that's when lifelong catechesis begins. I think we spend a lot of time catechizing people who have not yet explicitly chosen to follow Jesus. They're doing it as members of a culture and a family that is doing that, but they have not personally decided to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to give them the opportunity to say, yes, this is for me. Because that's when we make the shift from, like, up until that point, catechesis is a subject, or it's content that we are requiring them to learn, but that they don't really care about.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing it for a grade. After that point, they're doing it because it matters to them. That's the switch we want to make. Mm. So now you're going to have two groups of students, the ones who still say, I don't care, I just want an A, or I just don't want an F, right? And then the students who say, I want to learn more about Jesus because it deepens my faith. Mm-hmm. And so give them the opportunity to make that choice. And then with that same passion, enthusiasm, love for God, share the truth with them using the best instructional methods you can to help them learn, to help them grasp it. Because still, learning the truths of the faith are worthwhile, no matter whether somebody chooses to follow Jesus or not.
And it feels, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, that like the evangelization is not just so that a kid will accept Jesus and then they'll figure it out afterwards. Because I think even in my head, I fall into this trap that like, the job of an evangelist is to make someone else Catholic, and then once they're Catholic, check the box and you move on to the next person. And I imagine as an educator too, it's like, because it feels much more clear cut and much more like point A to point B of like, this student wasn't Catholic, I talked to them, now they're Catholic. Versus like, there was this Catholic student at the beginning of the year, he loved going to mass, but he didn't really know Jesus at all, and now he has a prayer life. Like the first one feels a lot better personally, and it feels a lot clearer as like a PEMDAS of the whole thing. It's like,
yeah.
It clicks a little bit differently. Have you seen that kind of play out a lot in your time working in education?
Yeah, and then it's easy to be very like stepwise in our approach and think there's going to be these clear divisions of like, okay, you go through this conveyor belt and then you're done.
Yeah,
like
that's a trap.
That's a incorrect analogy of, because
Totally.
humans are just way too complex for that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, like think in our own lives, there's times when we turn away from Jesus and choose sin instead of following him. And then we have our own little mini conversions and come back to him. Mm-hmm. And so we shouldn't be that surprised when we see the same thing in other people and see this tension between like following our temptations and choosing to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. But that's part of the deepening conversion. And so it's understandable that people struggle with that. What we're looking for is the signs that God's grace is being received and they're gradually turning more and more towards Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so like it's okay for conversion to be gradual and not dramatic and sudden. And that treats every person like an individual and not like they're going to go through the same repeatable process. So I think allowing people to reveal to us where they are rather than assuming we know is a really good step. And I'm borrowing that and paraphrasing from Sherry Waddell's Forming Intentional Disciples, where she says, never accept a label for a story. The label Catholic can mean many things, but if we allow somebody to reveal to us what that means to them, then we understand how it is we can walk with them towards a deeper love for Jesus.
Now, as an educator, and I think we've maybe touched on this on the podcast before, but I'm always so interested to talk about this one thing, that like, how do you marry that, like, it's a process, it takes time, you have to be patient, with like a sense of holy urgency that like the Lord isn't like, oh yeah, figure it out whenever. He's like, no, like this matters now, today. Like, how do you couple those things as an educator of like not getting apathetic? Because I think I fall into this trap a lot of like, oh no, that one friend who I've never even mentioned that I'm Catholic to, like, I'm just being patient. And it's like, no, I'm not, I'm procrastinating. Like, yeah, how do you do that?
I think there's a prudence of, like, I don't walk up to every person I meet and say, would you like to follow Jesus, right? There has to be sufficient signs that person's ready for that decision. Mm-hmm. And so if I were a teacher, right, would I do that on a daily basis? Would I be like thinking, okay, who am I going to ask today? No, I wouldn't. But I would probably say, okay, let's have a conversation as a school to determine like how can we create opportunities for students to step back from academics, step back from other distractions, and think only about their relationship with God, and then make that invitation, so that you're like otherwise it would just be, I think, artificial and forced. So we want to just invite people and let them choose, right? We don't, that's not like we need to build up to it for 4 years, but we also don't need to do it every 16 seconds. Look for the opportunity and invite students. Maybe we transition away from class level retreats for 100 or 400 students at a time, and instead do something that's a little more niche based. So do it as the members of a team, members of a sport, or even say, okay, like, September birthdays, you're going to have a September retreat, so it would be a little bit more work, but maybe it would produce better fruit, which is what we want ultimately. It might be hard to fit that into a schedule, but what's the priority again? And so everybody always finds a time to prioritize what's most important. And if it, like for instance, fire drills, every school does fire drills. That's not why schools exist, but they have to do them, so they do them. If we took the same sense of urgency of like, let's create an opportunity for students to have this personalized retreat, okay, we'll find a way to fit it in. I hope that answers the question of how do you address the urgency of doing this. So I think it's don't delay in doing this, but don't do it any sooner than you should.
It sounds like almost like, I mean, this analogy is coming to mind of like the process of evangelization is like watching a good football game. This analogy has been given about doing a good podcast as well. But it's like watching a good football game where like the ball is gradually moved down the field. And sometimes even in a great game, every great game, you snap the ball, you don't make any forward progress, but you did the play. And like every play, you're not bombing a Hail Mary, making a 70-yard touchdown. That like the job of an educator is to snap the ball every day. And sometimes you might put that ball into your hands and you might run into a wall of people and you're done with it.
Yeah.
And that's your play. But the urgency is like, let's get to the line, let's snap this ball. And then whatever happens that day is up to the Lord and what he does with that attempt.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not going to try to kick a field goal if you're on the opposing 20-yard line.
Yeah.
Right? Why? Because there's no chance of success.
Yeah.
And so what's the equivalent? Like if there are always going to be students who have some resistance to learning about God. That's where they are. And it could be because they've seen very poor examples of Christianity. And the only opportunity we have at that point is to provide a good example of what it means to be a follower of Jesus so that they can begin to trust God and his followers again.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make sense to like artificially force that person to demonstrate signs of conversion.
And to continue this analogy probably until it breaks down sometime soon, but like this in the same thought, if you're on the opposing 20-yard line trying to kick a field goal, your job as a team is not to be like, all right, let's just wait for that field goal to move closer. Like, let's just wait for the goalposts to move closer to us.
Absolutely.
Your job is to get there and to get into this area where you can enter into, I mean, to go back to the actual thing, into this relationship and to enter into the life of this student that you can show them the love of Christ. You can bring them these things with urgency, with like a very immediacy that isn't necessarily explicit, but it can still be immediate.
And evangelization takes place within the context of relationships. And I think we're all looking for a kind of like an automatic way to do this, right? If everybody just reads this book, watches this video, does this for 8 weeks, then they're good to go. And that's just not the way it works. Like,
I thought that's what was your sales pitch for your book.
Oh, I thought
that was your guys' marketing plan.
It's like, how did Jesus evangelize? Maybe we should do what he did. He invested heavily in 12 people for 3 years. Do we have that kind of patience? Now, look at the long-term fruit of that. It worked. It's not to say he didn't do the Sermon on the Mount. There's 5,000, right, just men. That's a part of it, right? We do, that's casting a wide net. And then you see, okay, from that big event, who wants to go deeper? Who's ready to continue this conversation? Maybe that's how we prioritize who we're going to spend more time with. And so the big event, you could say, from a classroom setting, that's just your daily lesson, your daily plan, how you're going to share the truth. And then students will, like, you'll just see along the way, this student wants to know more.
Mm. Now, to enter into this idea of Jesus and his 12, like, he spent these 3 years pouring into them, but after the crucifixion, like, they low-key bounced. And then at the resurrection, they came back, they got in check, and then they went out. Is that, like, I guess, is that analogous to the life of an educator? Do you feel like sometimes you'll pour into someone and then you'll disappear for a little bit and they'll bounce, and then, like, you need a resurrection moment?
I think where it breaks down is there's no moment in the life of an educator, or very rarely, that's analogous to the crucifixion, right? Like, that happened already, and that's the good news that we get to share.
Mm-hmm.
And so, thanks be to God, we don't have to go through that. Like, we don't have to answer the question, would I have said yes to Jesus had I been alive in his time?
Yeah.
Most people didn't, right? A very few number of people did. So we're the beneficiaries of people telling the story, telling the good news afterward. But yeah, there are going to be, like, people say no.
Mm-hmm.
They say no to Jesus. They're not saying no to you. They say no to Jesus. And then they come back, right, at the right time. Peter had an opportunity to say yes to Jesus when it mattered most, and he didn't. But then he came back. That's the important part. Come back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, others, like, never ran away. Mary was with him the whole way. John was with him the whole way. I remember there was a time when some students who were really active in some of the campus ministry activities went to a party and did some things that they regretted later, and they came to me. I happened to be out of town, so they came back, and we had a sit down with some of them, and there was a lot of contrition and remorse. And I think some people felt, oh, these students betrayed us. They sinned. I sinned. I betrayed God, right? And then I asked forgiveness, and he welcomes me back.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's not be surprised when sinners sin. Let's give everybody an opportunity and the open door to come back and choose again to renew themselves as followers of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, in an interesting way, I don't know that Americans love the idea of forgiveness and second chances. And maybe it's not just an American thing. Maybe it's like a global thing. Maybe,
Yeah.
But people, they're going to make mistakes. And you know what? Like, in the grand scheme of things, how big of a mistake are we talking about here? Because Jesus forgave people who killed him. So those people they're doing things that are not as egregious as that.
Yeah. As we're closing out here, you worked in the diocese for a while. For the evangelization of laity, but also definitely had your hand in the pot of Catholic schools and all that stuff. Is that correct? Right?
Yeah.
I'm not okay. What are some of the actual real life schools that you saw do these things well, and what did they do particularly to do it, and then, like, what changes were made, and like, in results?
So I had the good fortune of working with one of the previous guests, Amanda Livermore. Amanda actually hired me to help expand a campus ministry team on the campus of one of the Catholic high schools in the Diocese of Orlando. And what had started as I think initially a part-time campus ministry employee turned into a full-time, turned into a team with multiple people. And we prioritized conversion, and we created a place where students could have, let's say, a unobstructed or kind of like non-conflict of interest exchanges with people who are concerned about their relationship with God. And so nobody had to worry that they were going to get a bad grade when they were in campus ministry. And we used a couple interesting ideas about, like, how to help create a sense of belonging. And there's a whole body of literature out on that. So we just kind of borrowed the best ideas of how do we create a space that students call their own and feel like they belong, because then they'll return and there can be this sense of, like, hey, you know, I haven't seen you in a while. How have you been? And when people know they belong and know that people are going to miss them if they aren't there, it creates a bond and a connection that can lead to the kind of conversations we've been talking about.
How did you do that?
It's a physical, literal, actual space. Like, they dedicated a room to, okay, this is just for campus ministry. So we had that. We had a chapel. We had time in the calendar. And what we inherited was a model of class level of retreats. So every class got a retreat. And we changed it and said, how can we differentiate this? And so rather than saying, here, you're going to get a retreat with 400 of your closest friends, it was, how can we give you a retreat with 10 of your closest friends, with people who you care about and who you might want to have this experience with? And the easiest way to do that was by existing groups. So clubs, teams, it could be band, it could be art, it could be drama, it could be voice, it could be, different sports levels. And that seemed to have a really positive impact on the way students saw faith, because then it didn't feel like something that was forced upon them from without and was interrupting with their way of life, but it was something they got to do with people they already liked. And I think when you do things with people you like, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you enjoy them.
Totally. Just like this podcast.
There we go.
Exactly. That's all I needed. In that time, how much did the teachers at that school play a role into like the benefits you saw?
There were a lot of great opportunities for teachers to contribute. So they would go on mission trips with us. Mm-hmm. We did a couple of mission trips a year, and we would ask teachers who we thought would be able to witness to students about God's love. And they were able to come and have a big impact on it. We were able to share some of what we were doing with the faculty so that they understood. Once people know what you're doing, right, if you communicate your plan, they can be a part of it. If they don't know what you're doing, they don't know how to be on board. And so, if a principal is listening to this, if theology or religion faculty are listening to this and they say, like, I don't know how to begin to go about this, begin having conversations and share with people what the goals are. If people know where you're going, they can help you get there. If they don't know where you're going, right, if they just think you want more kids to get A's in religion, okay, how are they going to do that? Mm-hmm. If instead they know, well, we want to make sure that our students have a positive impression about followers of Jesus, well, they can play a direct role in that. And then they would, oftentimes they were chaplains or assistant coaches. And so they could be involved with, especially like some of the religion faculty, but we drew from everywhere. Cause you've got coaches who are coming from any department. That's often teachers just love helping and investing in students. Mm-hmm. So they would play a role in those smaller level retreats. And, there's already a lot of trust with that teacher and those students. Like, for instance, you go to the drama classroom, that's its own culture and club. Like, band is its own culture and club, for sure. Art, like, if you go to probably any school during lunch, there's kids who are in the art room finishing art projects, and they trust that place. They know I can be here. The teacher respects me and cares for me. And so there's already that trusted relationship there that the campus ministry staff might not enjoy, but together they can work, because then that faculty member who enjoys the trusted relationship can say, you know what, this is really important to me, and I wanted to share more about this with you, because I think this is such a treasure in our life.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I think that's a great place to wrap up too. I just love that idea of like creating a space in which the student feels free to be themselves, to exist without walls or barriers, and then from there, like actually meeting them there. Like, I think it's the actual concept of meeting someone where they're at. It doesn't mean talk to them whenever, however they are. It means like actually get to who they are and meet them there, where they're actually at, not just where they are at a moment.
Yeah. And maybe like a biblical image that I think would be a great thing for me to kind of end my thoughts on is that of the Good Shepherd. And do our events look more like the Good Shepherd going and seeking and hoping that, okay, like maybe this person's going to come and we can have this interaction, or the father of the prodigal son who's waiting for his son to come back, and the second he shows that interest, runs to him and embraces him, or like how much more often are we, and I'm not saying people are, but do we sit back and say, well, I'm going to force people to come to me in the way that I think they should, rather than kind of like being a missionary into their culture, and that like youth culture is its own thing. So are we comfortable going into that rather than forcing them to come to us and meet on our terms? And I think it's better to meet on their terms.
Wow. Dan, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on. Hopefully we'll be able to have you back. And there's a couple other topics at least that we were talking about before this that I would love to go deep on. But for now, thanks for coming out here. Everyone, thanks for watching. To end the podcast, we clap at the same time. We are out.